Grace, peace, and mercy all. It's Pastor Chris from Spruce Run Lutheran. I'm doing another Ask the Pastor, and this time the question is, what did you cover in the Paul Bible study? So we spent about 3 hours looking at various aspects of the Apostle Paul. So the first week we did sort of a broad brush strokes kind of approach to Paul. We looked, at his dates, so to speak, when he was doing different things. We looked at how Paul was transformed from being a zealot for the law to being essentially a zealot for Jesus. And while the people who were in the Bible study didn't, I guess I never said this explicitly, we were kind of playing with 3 different ways that people interpret the Apostle Paul. So a lot of it was coming from this book here about Paul and some of his interpreters, as well as a bunch of other books that go along with it, including N.T. Wright's Paul, which is a pretty darn good book. But one way or another, we looked at these 3 different perspectives. The first one, sort of the Lutheran perspective on Paul, is that Paul's big aha was that he was looking to find a loving God. And I think that's probably the kind of image of Paul that most of us have in our heads, especially those of us who are Lutheran. The second way of thinking about Paul that I brought up was the N.T. Wright understanding of Paul, sometimes called the new perspective on Paul, which the big aha moment for Paul in that one is that he's always asking questions about how we are being part of a community, right? That's the big fulcrum of Paul's ministry, that he's creating communities. Then the third way that we thought about Paul is sometimes called the apocalyptic perspective on Paul, which is that Paul's aha is that it's the transformation of the entire cosmos, the entirety of creation, that is the central thing going on with this Christianity thing. So, again, finding a loving God is one perspective. Another one is what it means to be connected in community. And the third one is the transformation of all of creation. So those are 3 different perspectives on Paul that we weaved together as we talked about it the first week. And we went from Paul being zealous for the law to Paul reassessing the law, then reassessing all the categories and coming up with only 2 categories, Spirit of Christ and Spirit of the Old World. And then the idea that Paul is creating Spirit of Christ communities. And then finally we hit upon some of the things that are almost a little funny, that Paul's really not a people person when you get down to it. So for example, at one point he tells people to mutilate themselves. He explains what being a part of a new creation is so badly that people assume that they are a new person and can marry their mothers. So things like that are just like, oh, Paul, it's great that you are, who you are, but you're also not hitting the mark sometimes. That you have these great ideas, then you have the actual community that you try to live them out in, and sometimes it doesn't work quite as well as it ought to. Then the second week, we looked at Paul between Rome and Jerusalem. Just the simple idea that Paul is ministering in some ways 2 different worlds. He's ministering in the world of Rome, the Greco-Roman world, where Caesar rules. And then also he's ministering within the context of Judaism, and that there's some tensions there. We talked about how the ancient world, quite simply put, is different than the world that we live in now. And one of the main differences is what religion is. That it was a binding together. That was religio. That's what religion was. It bound you to particular communities, to particular places. It also bound the spiritual world and the physical world together in particular places. So, that's why you had different gods and different communities that you had to appease. You wanted to make sure the citizens in the town, be they spiritual or physical, were being taken care of. So those are just kind of getting us into the mindset of the ancient world. Then we thought a little bit about Judaism, that there's sort of 4 pillars of Judaism's plural, because there's a lot of different Judaisms going on in Paul's time. But all of them, oh, by the way, so this is Sola here. He's been coming in and out of the picture a bit. Sorry, buddy. And so there's 4 different pillars of Judaism that all the different Judaism would kind of all in one way or another say, yeah, no, that's our thing. The big one is monotheism. There is but one God. Election, that the Jews are the chosen people. So if you're part of Judaism, you're part of God's chosen people, unique and different from other folk. Also, you believe that the law is important, the first 5 books of Moses, that kind of thing. And then also that the temple is important, that it is in fact the belly button, the navel of the world. It is of central import for you if you're a Jew. And so, thinking about that for a second, Paul, of course, is trying to make sure Christianity fits within those 4 pillars, that we can still say, oh, yep, that's us, right? Because Judaism was considered a licit cult as opposed to an illicit cult. So it was legal, right? It was an old religion, so it was okay in the Roman world. Whereas if it's a new religion in the Roman world, you're out. So it behooved Christianity and Paul's creation of these communities to be part of an old religion, because if it was a new religion, it was going to be persecuted. Then, so that was thinking about Judaism and the basic pillars that were around with the various Judaisms, plural, that existed at the time. Then Rome itself, one of the things to note is that there's an emperor cult, that there is in greater or lesser degrees, based on geography, based on when things are going on, a sense that the emperor is divine. Either the dead emperors and not the present one, and in some cases even the living emperor was a living god. And that being a part of the Roman Empire meant you were identifying with the emperor. You were seeing yourself, who you are, as being directly connected to the emperor in a variety of ways. For that matter, Christians at the time were dealing with idols every day. As I said in the sermon, I think it was last week, maybe 2 weeks ago, eating meat, if you're going to do that, and you weren't eating kosher meat, the only way you would get meat is to go through a pagan butcher of some sort. So the meat has passed through one cult or another, more likely than not. So Christians then, they're stuck in this weird middle liminal space. They're trying to figure out how they're still Jewish, but also they are trying to affirm that Jesus Christ is Lord, not Julius Caesar, and all the Caesars afterwards and before. So trying to find themselves in the midst of those 2 ways of being religious, being binding to particular communities, and that is a fine needle to thread that Paul, puts his best effort into, his blood, sweat, and tears, trying to put his community on a good footing with both those realities he's living with. So that was week 2. Week 3, we talked about the fact that we're reading Paul's letters. We're reading Paul's mail, right? Or more to the point, we're reading these Christian communities' mail from Paul. And what that means, though, is we're only reading half the story, right? We're reading what Paul has to say to the Corinthians, the Galatians, the Thessalonians, etc. But we're not getting what they're saying to him. And for that matter, we're not getting what other people might be saying to those communities. So I created 2 fictional letters to kind of get at what the other sides were that Paul was reacting to. So on one hand, I wrote a letter to the Galatians from the people who Paul's opposing. So the other side that is talking to the Galatians and trying to convince them of what Paul calls another gospel. So I get to write, the bad guy's letter, so to speak, or at least that's how Paul perceived those folk. Then the second one, I wrote the other side of 1 Thessalonians. So what's Paul responding to when he's writing to the Thessalonians? They're for the first time writing possibly his first letter. So I, write, hey, Paul, here's some things we're trying to figure out, namely, people are dying and Jesus hasn't came back yet. What do we do? Oh my goodness. And for that matter, we're being persecuted. What does that mean for us being faithful people? And also, hey, Paul, please come back. You didn't tell us all the things we needed to know, or at least we don't feel like we did. So then Paul responds with his letter to the Thessalonians. So again, I wanted us to use our imagination a bit to get into the other side of things. Because whenever we're dealing with Paul, we're always dealing with analogy, right? Because he's writing to particular communities who are experiencing particular problems and situations. And we consider those solutions he has to be Holy Writ, right? And then what do you do with that? Because, we're not the Thessalonians. We're not from Corinth. We're not Galatians. And we have different problems, but hopefully we can figure out the ways that we have similar problems. And one of the ways to get at that is to figure out what they were saying to Paul in the first place. So, that is boiling 3 hours worth of Bible study into apparently about 12 minutes according to the little clock at the bottom of my phone that's recording this. So that's what we've been up to in the Paul Bible study. And just to let you all know, we're going to be doing a new Bible study in a couple weeks. I'm still juggling what subject we're going to look at. Probably the book of Job, but there's 2 others I'm also mulling over. So just look at that. Look for that in your email that we'll be starting up a new one soon. And of course, whenever we start a new Bible study, it's a great time to hop in, right? That some folk will probably hop out because they're not up for whatever the next subject is, but some other people will be like, oh my goodness, that's super exciting. So just watch your emails for that, and I'm looking forward to seeing you all. We've, did initial stuff with Paul, and now we'll do something new. But thank you all who did attend one or all of the Bible studies on Paul, and thank you all for listening to this. God bless.